I remember the first time I heard about the Green River Killer case. It was a cloudy day, the kind of weather that makes shadows seem longer than they actually are, and I was immersed in one of those true crime shows that always manage to pull me in. But this case was different. There was something in the way it was told that made me stop and pay closer attention. The Green River, in Washington state, winds peacefully through trees and mountains. A place that used to symbolize natural beauty, a refuge for those looking to escape the noise and rush of the city. But in the 1980s, that same river became the scene of a series of crimes that terrified not just the region but the entire country. The name Gary Ridgway wasn't known back then, but his actions were already beginning to mark the start of a dark story that would take more than 2 decades to unravel. I've often wondered how someone like him could go unnoticed for so long. How could an ordinary man, a man who worked painting trucks, who had a family, a seemingly normal life, hide such a monstrous nature? While people went on with their lives, Ridgway was hunting. And he did it without raising suspicion, hidden behind the mask of normalcy. The first disappearances began in 1982. At first, they didn't seem connected. Sex workers, young women living on the margins of society, vanished without a trace. It took authorities a while to realize there was a pattern, that something far more sinister was happening. When they began to recover the women's bodies, discarded along the river, it became clear that a serial killer was on the loose. Fear quickly grew. But so did the frustration. The police always seemed to be one step behind this ghost, who kept leaving a trail of death in his wake. And while investigations continued, Ridgway went on with his life, with no one suspecting him. Here's where a question that has haunted me since I started looking into this case arises. How can someone so close, so ordinary, commit such brutal acts without being discovered? It's a mystery that stays with me and makes me think of all the times we might cross paths with people who carry dark secrets inside, and we won't know until it's too late. But what's even more unsettling is how society also failed. The Green River Killer's victims were mostly young women living on the margins, women that society had discarded. And that was the first big mistake. For a long time, authorities didn't see them as valuable people, worthy of protection. And Ridgway knew that. He knew exactly whom to target, knew that no one would miss them, or at least, that no one would search for answers with the necessary urgency. He took advantage of that void. He hid in indifference. I can't stop thinking about the river, how its calm waters hid so many secrets, how Ridgway used its anonymity to continue. What other secrets does that place hold? How many more may have been victims without us even knowing? This is a case that, even today, decades later, leaves us with more questions than answers. As we follow this story, I'm going to take you with me through the investigations, the mistakes, the moments when justice was close but failed. Together, we'll unravel the mysteries surrounding the Green River Killer, a man who for years deceived everyone except his victims. Now, what allowed someone like Ridgway to keep operating without getting caught for so long? That's one of the questions we'll try to answer as we move forward. But I warn you, the truth isn't as simple or comforting as it might seem. The first crimes, how it all began. The first signs of something sinister in the Green River area began to surface in 1982. During those years, the city of Seattle was in a state of euphoria and expansion. Music, the tech boom, and the vibrant city atmosphere seemed disconnected from the dark events that were beginning to unfold on the outskirts. The reality was that, beneath this cheerful surface, a nightmare was taking shape. The early known victims of the Green River Killer had little in common beyond their vulnerability. They were mostly young women, many of whom were involved in prostitution. At the time, prostitution carried a deep stigma, and many of these women lived in the shadows of society, marginalized and unprotected. This gave them an uncomfortable invisibility that Ridgway exploited with chilling efficiency. The first recorded case of a missing woman in the Green River area was that of Yolanda Sapp, a 23-year-old street worker trying to rebuild her life. Her disappearance was noticed by some, but unfortunately, it wasn't impactful enough to generate immediate public alarm. A few days later, her body was found in the wooded area near the river. While her case wasn't isolated in terms of disappearances, the connection between these events wasn't immediately apparent. The disappearances continued, and with each new addition to the list of missing persons, the pattern became more evident. Marge Wilson, another woman who went missing in the summer of 1982, was a well-known figure on the streets. Her absence caused more commotion, but the police were still dealing with vague leads and uncertain testimonies. Initially, the investigations yielded no concrete results. Authorities were working with limited resources and struggled to connect the dots. The lack of reliable witnesses and scant forensic evidence further complicated the resolution of the cases. What the police didn't know at the time was that the killer was deeply aware of how to manipulate the crime scene. Ridgeway, with his meticulous nature, knew how to erase traces and evade detection, allowing him to stay one step ahead of the authorities. This is where the first moments of confusion and unease arose. As the disappearances continued, local residents began to share rumors. Some mentioned a man who had been seen lurking in the area, but these leads were vaguely confirmed and often dismissed as mere speculation. However, one crucial question began to emerge: how could someone operate in such a populated area without being detected? As months passed and more bodies were found, concern grew. The local press began to pay more attention to the cases, and talk of a possible serial killer started to spread. But initially, the concept of a serial killer operating in that area wasn't fully accepted. Officials were still treating each case separately, unaware of the larger connection. This was a crucial moment in the history of the Green River crimes. The lack of coordination between different departments and the reluctance to consider a behavioral pattern were significant mistakes. Not only did the profile of the killer remain undefined, but the idea of a serial killer wasn't as prevalent in the public mind as it would be today. Questions began to float in the air. Why wasn't the pattern identified sooner? How did Ridgeway manipulate misinformation and skepticism? The answer isn't as clear as one might expect. Part of it stems from how the victims were perceived by society and how prostitution was treated at the time. But it also reflects Ridgeway's ability to evade detection, manipulating circumstances to his advantage. The story of the first crimes is like a series of puzzle pieces that were slowly falling into place. Each new victim added more weight to the growing mountain of evidence, but time and a lack of cohesion among law enforcement allowed the killer to keep operating. Ridgeway, meanwhile, remained in the shadows, perfecting his method and his skill at evading the authorities. This is the first glimpse into a criminal mind that defied expectations and outwitted the system. The case of the Green River Killer is one where the combination of systemic errors and a Machiavellian mind played a crucial role. The mysteries surrounding how these crimes could continue for so long without a clear resolution is part of what makes this story so chilling. As we move forward in our exploration, we'll see how Ridgeway not only deceived the police but also those closest to him. His ability to hide the truth and manipulate his surroundings made him one of the most notorious and puzzling serial killers in modern history. How was he able to maintain his facade of normalcy while committing such atrocities? That is the question that continues to haunt the minds of everyone who delves into the enigma of the Green River Killer. The rise of the killer, a monster in the shadows. In the bustling world of 1980 Seattle, while the city thrived on its flourishing music and cultural scene, a monster moved stealthily, casting his shadow over society's darkest corners. Gary Ridgeway, known as the Green River Killer, was at the height of his terrifying reign during this period, solidifying his chilling reputation. This is the moment when his legend began to take shape, a dark and grim chapter that unveils the true scope of his terror. By the summer of 1982, the increasing number of disappearances had already caught the attention of local authorities. The pattern was clear to those willing to see it. Young women, often in vulnerable situations, were vanishing without a trace. But the case wasn't easily solved, and each disappearance seemed like just another mystery on a long list of unsolved cases. Ridgeway moved through the shadows of the city with the skill of a predator. His ability to deceive and manipulate those around him was remarkable. He led an apparently normal and respectable life, working as a truck painter. This double life was key to his success. While his neighbors and co-workers suspected nothing, Ridgeway was committing atrocities that left the community trembling. The rise of the killer wasn't just in his criminal activity. It was also reflected in how the community and the media began to pay more attention to him. As the press echoed the disappearances and bodies were discovered, panic slowly set into the city. However, despite the growing concern, authorities still struggled to connect the dots. Ridgeway, in his role as a master of deception, knew how to evade suspicion. When a body turned up in the Green River area, he made sure to meticulously erase any traces. He knew how to manipulate the crime scene, leaving little or no evidence behind. His ability to move freely without arousing suspicion was one of the reasons he was able to operate for so long. A crucial factor in his rise was the modus operandi that Ridgeway perfected over time. He began to develop a specific pattern that involved abducting his victims, killing them, and then disposing of their bodies in strategic locations near the Green River. This pattern not only complicated the authorities' work but also added to the mysteries surrounding the cases. During this period, Ridgeway also had the cunning to change his approach to avoid capture. As the media and authorities focused on building a profile of the serial killer, Ridgeway began to alter his methods to divert attention. Instead of following a clear pattern, he started diversifying his methods and the locations where he left the bodies. This added an extra layer of difficulty for authorities, who were already struggling with a lack of concrete evidence. The killer's rise was also reflected in the stories circulating within the community. Rumors of a possible serial killer became the talk of bars, coffee shops, and streets. People were scared and confused. Local residents began to be more cautious, avoiding areas where they knew crimes had occurred. However, fear and paranoia failed to capture the truth immediately. The most unsettling aspect of this period was the psychological game Ridgeway played. As authorities issued warnings and tried to alert the public to the threat, Ridgeway seemed to revel in the confusion and chaos he was causing. For him, each disappearance and each body found was proof of his ability to stay one step ahead of the law. A key part of his rise was how Ridgeway manipulated the profile being constructed about the killer. At first, investigators didn't have a clear profile of the criminal. The lack of clear patterns and the diversity of victims made the killer's profile inaccurate. Ridgeway took advantage of this lack of clarity to hide behind a facade of normalcy while continuing his reign of terror. The rise of the Green River Killer can also be seen in the impact it had on the lives of affected families. Each new victim not only increased the number of missing people but also tore apart families and communities. The sense of helplessness and despair among the victims' loved ones was palpable, and the authorities' inability to solve the case only exacerbated the suffering. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the killer's rise was his ability to continue operating while authorities were in constant pursuit. Ridgeway's meticulous nature, combined with investigative deficiencies and the lack of a coordinated response, allowed the killer to continue his reign of terror for what seems like an interminable period in retrospect. Looking back, it's chilling to think about how Ridgeway was able to maintain his facade while committing such horrific acts. His ability to evade detection and manipulate the situation in his favor is a grim reminder of what happens when a killer moves with precision and cunning in an environment that is not fully prepared to confront his threat. The rise of the Green River Killer is a dark chapter in criminal history, a story that shows how the combination of a cunning criminal and a justice system at a disadvantage can allow horror to continue. As the story unfolds, the true extent of Ridgeway's depravity and his impact on the community becomes increasingly evident, leaving an indelible mark on the history of Seattle and in the minds of all those who dare to uncover the truth behind his reign of terror. The hunt for a ghost, mistakes and confusion in the investigation. The hunt for a ghost is exactly what the investigation into the Green River Killer seemed like during those turbulent years. Imagine being in the shoes of an investigator in the midst of this chaos, searching for clues in every corner of Seattle while facing a killer who moved with the elusiveness of a shadow. The task was monumental, not only because of the brutality of the crimes, but also due to the fog of confusion and mistakes that shrouded every step of the investigation. The challenge began as soon as bodies started appearing in the Green River area. Authorities found themselves in a maze of uncertainties. Every corpse they discovered was a new puzzle that, instead of providing answers, only raised more questions. Who was behind these crimes? What connected them? The lack of a clear pattern turned the investigation into an ever-changing enigma. A major problem was the lack of coordination between different police departments. The investigation was spread across multiple jurisdictions, each with its own set of priorities and approaches. This lack of coordination meant that information didn't flow as it should, and valuable leads were often lost in the bureaucracy. Instead of a cohesive effort, it seemed like each unit was battling the killer on their own, with fragments of evidence scattered throughout the city. The first big confusion came when authorities tried to establish a profile of the killer. The absence of a clear pattern in the victims made the initial profile inaccurate. The victims didn't share many common characteristics aside from their vulnerability and tragic fate. Some were sex workers, others were in difficult situations, and others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. This lack of coherence in the victims made investigators question whether they were dealing with a serial killer or someone simply seizing opportunities. One of the most notable errors was the over-reliance on witness testimonies and descriptions. In a city as large and diverse as Seattle, descriptions could be vague and often contradictory. People who had seen something suspicious or interacted with a victim before their disappearance provided descriptions that, in many cases, didn't fit the killer's profile. This disparity further complicated the identification and capture process. As the investigation progressed, efforts were made to link the crimes through forensic evidence analysis. However, even here, things didn't go as expected. The technology of the time, though advanced for its era, wasn't up to the level of sophistication that investigators needed. The ability to analyze fingerprints, DNA, and other remains was limited, and forensic evidence didn't always provide the clarity needed to connect the dots. A particularly frustrating example was the handling of fingerprints found at the crime scenes. Investigators discovered prints that didn't match any existing databases. Instead of focusing on the fact that they could belong to a new and unknown suspect, some misguided theories led the police to dismiss the prints or not give them the importance they deserved. This slip-up led to missed opportunities and growing frustration within the investigative teams. Interviews with possible witnesses and suspects also proved to be a minefield of mistakes. The pressure to solve the case led investigators to question many individuals who, though harmless, were treated as suspects in an attempt to find some connection. This not only drained resources but also created a climate of distrust between the community and the police. People began to question the authorities' effectiveness and doubt their ability to protect them. Additionally, the public and media pressure increased with each new case. The media, always hungry for sensational stories, quickly brought details of the crimes to light, often exacerbating the panic in the community. Speculations and theories about the killer began filling the headlines, contributing to more confusion and distracting from more rigorous investigative approaches. One particularly memorable incident occurred when a group of investigators decided to follow a lead based on an unfounded rumor about a suspect seen near one of the crime scenes. Following this lead not only proved fruitless but also diverted the investigators' attention from other lines of inquiry that could have led to the real killer's capture. The environment in which the investigation was carried out also played a significant role in the mistakes and confusion. Seattle was experiencing rapid growth and urban expansion, which complicated the task of tracking and securing crime scene areas. The developing infrastructure and changes in the city often hampered investigators' ability to maintain a precise track of areas related to the case. Throughout all this chaos, what most bothered the authorities was the feeling that they were hunting a ghost. The errors, lack of coordination, and absence of clear evidence made the capture of the killer seem more distant with each passing day. The frustration was palpable, and as more bodies continued to appear, the weight of uncertainty and public pressure mounted. The hunt for the Green River Killer was undoubtedly a chase through an endless labyrinth, filled with unexpected twists and difficult obstacles to overcome. Amid all this, the Green River Killer continued his reign of terror, his shadow moving with calculated precision while chaos reigned in the investigation. The story of the hunt for this ghost is a chilling lesson in how human error, lack of coordination, and panic can sabotage even the most crucial investigations. As investigators faced these challenges, the truth remained an enigma, hidden in the depths of a mystery that seemed to have no end. The Forgotten Victims, a society that failed. As we delve into the story of the Green River Killer, we cannot overlook a painful yet crucial aspect: the victims who, amidst the noise of drama and the desperate search, became forgotten shadows. Every name on the list of victims is a life cut short, an untold story, a face that faded from collective memory. It's easy to get caught up in the morbid details of the case and the hunt for the monster, but behind each number are real human beings, whose lives and deaths reflect a profound failure of society. The victims of the Green River Killer were not people who lived in the spotlight of social attention. They were young women, often in vulnerable situations, trapped in the invisibility of urban shadows. They were sex workers, young people seeking to escape their problems, and some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the context of Seattle, a city undergoing growth and transformation, many of these women lived on the margins of society, far from the bright lights of downtown. In the case of sex workers especially, the tragedy runs even deeper. The community often looked down on them, and their work placed them in a vulnerable position that was frequently ignored or minimized. Authorities, in an attempt to address the problem, often fell into the trap of seeing them only as statistics rather than individuals with their own stories and struggles. This dehumanization allowed the killer to operate with impunity, and his horror was minimized by the same society that was supposed to protect them. In hindsight, it's chilling to consider how the patterns of the victims intertwined with broader social failures. Many of the women were young, drawn into prostitution out of economic necessity or fleeing broken homes. The lack of social and economic support left these women in precarious situations, making them easy targets for a predator. How is it possible for a society that prides itself on progress to allow its most vulnerable members to be ignored in such a way? One of the most tragic victims was a 15-year-old girl who, after disappearing from her home in search of a better life, found herself ensnared by the killer. Her case not only revealed the cruelty of the murderer, but also the failure of a system that couldn't protect her or offer a way out of her desperate situation. Her disappearance and eventual murder highlighted the lack of resources for at-risk youth and the indifference that can arise when someone doesn't fit the conventional mold of a worthy victim. The case of the victims also exposes deficiencies in the response from the community and law enforcement. Reports of disappearances often did not receive the urgency they deserved. The victims' families, frequently in precarious conditions and without necessary support, faced a double battle, searching for their loved ones while fighting against indifference and a lack of resources. Instead of receiving the support and attention they needed, they found themselves in a sea of bureaucracy and disregard. The story of each victim is a window into a world that, in many ways, was ignored until the terror became undeniable. Interviews with friends and families reveal stories of love, shattered dreams, and despair. These people were not just figures in a police report, they were daughters, sisters, and friends. Their lives were filled with aspirations and fears, and their deaths left a painful void in those who knew them. But the narrative in the media and the investigation often did not do justice to these individual lives. The way society treated the victims also profoundly impacted how the case is remembered. Media portrayals tended to focus on the macabre details of the case, often at the expense of the personal stories of the victims. Morbidity and sensationalism outweighed respect and empathy, reducing the victims to mere characters in a horror narrative instead of individuals with lives and legacies of their own. In the context of the investigation, there were attempts to connect the victims through patterns and profiles, but the lack of focus on the individual particularities of each case led to an incomplete understanding. Law enforcement and the community often centered on the killer, rather than providing the necessary support to the victims' families and recognizing their suffering. This approach contributed to the perception that the victims were somehow responsible for their tragic fate, a cruel belief that perpetuated indifference to their plight. Society's failure to protect and remember these victims serves as a grim reminder of our priorities. The lack of support and attention they received revealed an uncomfortable truth about how people in vulnerable situations can be easily overlooked. Instead of confronting the pain and injustice comprehensively, society often opts to focus on sensational stories and the pursuit of culprits, leaving the victims and their personal stories forgotten. As the Green River investigation progressed, the voices of the victims faded into the background noise of periodic updates and speculation. The personal stories of those murdered became distant echoes, replaced by morbid fascination with the killer and the details of his crimes. The true tragedy, however, is that these lives, full of potential and love, were treated as mere data in a case that needed solving. Over time, the case of the Green River Killer became a horror story retold and reiterated, but the humanity and pain behind each victim often fell out of focus. The lessons to be learned from this tragedy go beyond the capture of the killer and center on how we treat those on the margins of our society. The true measure of our humanity is reflected in how we treat the most vulnerable among us and how we remember and honor the lives lost amidst the horror. The story of the victims of the Green River Killer is a call for reflection and action. It reminds us that behind every crime are human stories that deserve to be heard and respected. As we reflect on this dark chapter in Seattle's history, it is vital to remember the people who lost their lives and consider how our actions and attitudes can prevent similar tragedies in the future. The loss of these lives and society's failure to protect them are lessons we must face with seriousness. The victims of the Green River Killer deserve to be remembered not only for the tragic circumstances of their deaths, but for the lives they lived and the loves they left behind. As we continue exploring the case, let us not forget that the true story lies in the lives of those who were forgotten in the hunt for the killer. The fall of the monster, DNA, and delayed justice. After years of uncertainty and terror, the fall of the Green River Killer came like a bolt from a stormy sky, an abrupt end that had been so long awaited it felt almost unreal. Those who had closely followed the case knew the truth lay hidden in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. The resolution of the case did not come easily or directly. Instead, it was the result of a combination of scientific advancements and unwavering persistence. The use of DNA in criminal investigations has transformed the way complex cases are solved. In this particular case, science became the crucial tool that connected the dots between years of collected evidence and the man who would finally be held responsible for a seemingly endless series of atrocious crimes. What had once seemed an unsolvable puzzle began to come together with unsettling precision. I vividly remember the moment the news broke through the media. After so many years of fruitless searching, the authorities had finally found a key piece of the puzzle, the DNA profile of the Green River Killer. This breakthrough was the result of years of diligent work and the use of new forensic techniques that had been refined over time. It was as if science had finally achieved what instinct and intuition could not, capturing the killer who had eluded the police and society for so long. The revelation that the DNA collected from the crime scenes matched that of a known suspect was a turning point. It was like a light in the darkness, a sign that the search was over and justice was finally within reach. But how did DNA become the key in this case, and what did it mean for the final resolution? DNA, as we know, is a unique fingerprint that every individual carries. For decades, investigators had collected DNA samples from the crime scenes, but at the time, the technology wasn't advanced enough to make a clear connection. It was only with the advent of new technologies and forensic genetics that DNA profiles could be compared with existing databases, leading to the long-sought match. The connection was made when authorities reviewed the DNA profiles obtained from the victims and compared them to a database of known criminals. In a chilling coincidence, the profiles matched that of a man who had previously been arrested for minor offenses. That man's name was Gary Ridgeway, known to some as the Green River Killer. Gary Ridgeway was no stranger to the authorities. He had been arrested on several occasions and had passed through the judicial system in various circumstances. However, what no one had suspected was that this seemingly ordinary man harbored a dark secret. He was the killer behind a string of horrific crimes that had terrorized the region for years. The news of his arrest was met with a mixture of relief and horror as the true scale of what had been discovered came into focus. Ridgeway's arrest led to a series of legal proceedings that, although necessary, only offered delayed justice. The victims were no longer there to witness the resolution of their suffering, and their families had waited for years to get answers. The legal process was long and complex, with Ridgeway facing multiple charges, including first-degree murder and other serious offenses. The final resolution came when Ridgeway confessed to his crimes in a plea deal. This agreement allowed authorities to obtain crucial details about the murders and recover the bodies of some victims who had not yet been found. It was a bittersweet moment. The certainty of the killer's identity and the partial closure for the families contrasted with the pain and horror of the revelations that emerged. Despite justice finally being served, the resolution of the case left a deep sadness. The victims and their families had waited years for answers, and the nature of Ridgeway's crimes had left an indelible mark on the community. The fall of the Green River Killer did not bring complete relief, but rather a complex mix of emotions: sadness for the lost lives and painful reflection on the systemic failures that allowed such crimes to go on for so long. In retrospect, the case of the Green River Killer is a chilling reminder of how justice can be slow, but also of how science and persistence can ultimately unmask those who seek to remain in the shadows. The fall of the monster was the result of a collective effort that combined modern technology with the tireless work of those who refused to give up the search for truth. Gary Ridgway's story, The Green River Killer, remains a warning of the dangers that can lurk in the most unexpected places, and a reminder of the importance of never stopping the pursuit of justice, even when hope seems lost. The resolution of the case, though painful, brought with it a lesson in resilience and society's ability to confront its own horrors with determination and courage. The truth behind the Green River Killer's crimes, uncovered through DNA and meticulous investigation, offers closure, albeit delayed, for a dark chapter in criminal history. As we reflect on these events, it is essential to remember both the victims and the unsung heroes who fought for justice, and to consider how we can continue learning and progressing to protect the most vulnerable in our society. Thus concludes the story of the Green River Killer, a tale of horror and justice, of darkness and revelation. In the echo of these events, let us never forget the lives lost or the pain endured, and may the memory of the victims serve as a lasting reminder of the need to protect and honor every human being in our community. Reflections on Justice and Error. After all the pain and chaos surrounding the case of the Green River Killer, one might wonder if we truly achieved what we wanted: justice. The capture and conviction of Gary Ridgway, the man who terrorized so many people, marked a pivotal moment in criminology and in the lives of the affected families. But at the end of this long journey, what have we really learned about justice and error? When I think about the resolution of this case, I can't help but feel a mix of relief and deep reflection. Justice was finally served, but not without a series of complications and difficulties that left deep scars in the community. DNA and modern investigative techniques played a crucial role, revealing the truth that had been hidden for so long. However, the arrival of the truth also brought with it the harsh reality that time cannot restore what has been lost. The families of the victims had waited years for a resolution that always seemed out of reach. The relief of knowing who was responsible for such horrendous crimes was accompanied by the pain of recalling their loved ones' suffering. How do you measure justice in such circumstances? Can a sentence truly compensate for the loss of a life? The criminal justice system, however rigorous, can never fill the void left by the loss of a loved one. As I reflect on the Green River Killer case, I wonder how the justice system can learn from these events to avoid similar mistakes in the future. The investigation that eventually led to Ridgway's capture was full of obstacles and challenges. Confusion, errors, and coordination failures between agencies revealed that, even with the best technology and efforts, the system doesn't always live up to expectations. Humanity and imperfection are intrinsically tied to justice, and recognizing this is crucial for improvement. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case was the delay in solving it. The search for Ridgway and the gathering of evidence were long and arduous processes. Forensic science, which was eventually fundamental to his capture, also took time to develop sufficiently to be useful in solving the case. In the interim, many errors were made, and the victims' families suffered while waiting for answers. This reality highlights the importance of not only relying on technology but also on the capacity of institutions to adapt and continuously improve. The most significant lesson we can take from this story is the importance of perseverance and constant vigilance in the pursuit of justice. The resolution of the Green River Killer case was a testament to the commitment of investigators and the judicial system to face challenges, even when they seemed insurmountable. But it is also a reminder that justice is not a destination, but a continuous process that requires constant reflection and adjustment. As this case reached its final stage, Ridgeway's capture and conviction brought a measure of closure, but also a call to action to prevent such errors from recurring. The victims' families, despite their pain and sadness, found some peace in seeing the responsible party finally face the consequences of his actions. Society as a whole learned valuable lessons about justice, vigilance, and the need for continued support for those at the center of such tragedies. As a society, we must also ask ourselves how we can continue to move forward to prevent future horrors. What steps must we take to improve our justice systems and ensure that no more cases emerge where answers arrive too late? The experience of the Green River Killer case should inspire a renewed commitment to excellence in investigation and support for the victims' families. Ultimately, justice for the victims is not measured only by the capture of the culprit, but by the effort made to understand and learn from the mistakes that were made. True justice involves recognizing the pain, doing everything possible to prevent future errors, and above all, providing continuous support to those who have been affected. It is a complex and often painful process, but one we must approach with sincerity and determination. So we conclude our exploration of the Green River Killer case. The story of Gary Ridgway challenges us to think about the nature of justice, the limits of technology, and the need for consistent humanity in our institutions. As we look to the future, we must remember the lessons learned and commit to building a system that can offer quicker and fairer responses, and above all, one that honors the victims and their families in the way they deserve. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey through one of the most complex and disturbing cases in criminal history. The story of the Green River Killer leaves us with much to ponder, and I hope it has served to illuminate not only the horrors of the crimes, but also the opportunities to improve and advance in the pursuit of justice.